Okay, so into the demo here for AddXYDemo, I'm going to build this from scratch. So I basically have an empty arc map here, and I do also have the Adobe PDF for the lecture, so I will refer to that periodically. You'll see that I'll come back to this slide. So we'll talk about the arc map interface, data frames, data view, and layout view, and the tools, and then we'll talk about the other information as I mentioned in the previous lecture. But for now, I'm just going to do the AddXYDemo for you guys so that you get an idea of what you should be doing for assignment number 2. So I'm just going to go ahead and add some data here. So I'm going to be looking somewhere on my either my flash drive or on my hard drive or out on a network for some data. So I'm going to be looking in my folder connections. So when I see that I click on folder connections, I have none, so I can use the little plus sign here to create a folder connection to wherever my data is located. So in this case, I'm going to look under computer, and I'm going to go to my flash drive. And I got a whole bunch of folders here, and there's my Intro to GIS folder. I'm going to go ahead and just say OK there. You can see I have different folders for the different classes that I teach at Towson, your web class, and then of my in-person class. So I'm just going to go ahead and say Intro to GIS, and I'll have access to all 3 of these folders. So I'll say OK here, and there are those 3 folders. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the in-class folder, because that's where my data is stored, and I'll go into my demos folder, and there's my AddXYDemo folder, and I'm just going to add one piece of data for now called countries. And so that's just going to be a shapefile, and as I mentioned in the lecture, that ArcMap's going to pick some sort of random color. I can change that if I want. I can just go ahead and use the HSV sliders if I want. I can go to more colors here, and this is what I mentioned in the lecture. I can switch this to HSV, and so of course I've got my hue, my saturation, and my value, and I can choose what color, how dark I want it to be, how much of a particular color, and what color in particular I want. I can also use cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, CMYK, or RGB, red, green, and blue, different proportions of visible light. So I'm going to take this way down so I can get these nice little grays in here. I'm just going to kind of keep that sort of almost a muted gray kind of color. So that's what we call a shapefile, and I'll lecture on different data formats in the next module and what you can expect to see in terms of raster data and vector data. I'm also going to add another piece of data in here. I'm just going to go to Add Data. Again, and you'll notice I have worldcities.dbf. That is a database file, DBF. That is the native format to DBase, and we will use DBase files as part of our shape files, which store the attributes for shapefiles. And you see them a little bit differently in ArcMap and ArcCatalog than you would, say, in Windows Explorer. However, we're going to just add this table of world cities, and you're going to see that the interface changes a little bit over here. I'm going to expand this just a little bit so we can see almost that entire path. We can see that I've added data from my E drive, which is my flash drive, my Intro to GIS folder, CCBC in class, lectures, demo, demos, AddXYDemo. So you can see I'm pretty particular about my folder structures. You guys can make fun of me all you want for that. Anyway, so if I come over here to list by drawing, list by drawing order, I'm going to click on that, and you can still see the world over here, the countries, but notice that the table goes away, and that's because this is only data that is visible over here in the data frame. So when I click on list by source, it shows me the source to all the data, it shows me the countries shapefile that I've added in there, and it shows me the world cities, which again is just a table. It's what I call a flat file. Make a note of that. I call tables that have no geometry, points, lines, or polygons attached to them flat files. Alright, so I'm going to open up this flat file. I'm going to right click on it, and I'm just going to open it. I'm going to see I have a bunch of information about cities around the world. Okay, so what? Big deal. Well, these are all the attributes that we talked about, our points, lines, and polygons having, and the 2 attributes that I'm really concerned with here are the X and the Y coordinates. So in this case we have a table that has that information, so we can generate information, actual spatial information, spatial data from these 2 fields. So how do we do that? We can just right click on that and do display XY data, and again you guys are going to be practicing this in chapter 18 specifically when you do it for a hurricane, a typhoon in the Philippines. In this case we're doing world cities. As part of the assignment you'll be doing earthquakes. So in this case we're going to look for the X field, so that's going to be in the X direction, so that's going to be our longitude, and that's going to be in the point X field. And you'll see we're going to be doing the Y field, which is our latitude, north and south of the equator, and that's captured within our point Y field. it automatically grabs the coordinate system of the gray countries file that I have in there, and this is Geographic Coordinate System, GCS, World Geodetic Survey 1984. And I'll explain in our Projections and Coordinate Systems lecture in a few weeks what this information means. But for now, we're just going to take the default here and we're going to say OK. And boom, we've basically created a layer that is now visible from the coordinates within this table. We've created what we call an event theme, and that's why they call it World Cities Events. Notice it's the World Cities table, and we've created these events for World Cities. So now we have points that exist on our map. And of course, we can query those points just like we do any other information. And what we saw in the original flat file table is also part of those events. Now, this events layer, it's important to remember, is just temporary within this one MXD, within this project. It's called untitled.mxd right now. And so that's important to remember. And so when I come back to this PDF of our lecture, MXD files, important to note here, MXD files are map document files. I mentioned it in the first lecture, but what's really important to remember is that it is a pointer file to your data. So always important to remember that this MXD that we're looking at here, this map document, this project, does not actually contain this data physically. This data exists on disk somewhere, whether it's your flash drive, your hard drive, or a network location. And this file, this project file, this map document file, points to that location and creates your map. So those are important things to remember as you start to move data around, working on projects maybe at home or at the office or coming into the lab. Those are things to always consider as you're moving data around and moving your MXDs around. So remember that it is a pointer file to your data. Your files exist somewhere, your layers exist somewhere, and an MXD points to them. So that's why this pathing information is so important. I did want to point out one thing, that again, this is temporary within this MXD file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually make that permanent. Right now, that file does not exist anywhere on disk. If I click on this ArcCatalog window, it's actually going to launch ArcCatalog from over here on the right, and I can go to the folder connection that I just established a little while ago in my in-class folder where my demos are located for all my classes, and go into that AddXYDemo folder, and you can see there's the country shapefile that you see, and I'll explain what a shapefile is as we move on throughout the course, and then the World Cities table. But you notice that there is not a World Cities events layer in here because, again, events is temporary in memory. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right click on World Cities Events. I'm going to go to Data, and then I'm going to come down here to, I'm going to go, pardon me, I'm going to go to Data, and I'm going to go to Export Data. And so what that's going to do is it's going to take that temporary events layer, and it's going to write out a permanent file. Now in this case, we're not going to be using personal or file geodatabases to export this data to. We're going to send it out to what's called a shapefile. I'll talk about these two in the next lecture when I talk about different data formats. So I'm going to go into the folder, into my Intro to GIS folder, where I have my demos located. And again, the AddXYDemo, and these are a lot of the other demos that you guys will see throughout the semester. And there is my country shapefile, which is also reflected over here in ArcCatalog. And again, this is the ArcCatalog window within ArcMap, but you also have to remember that you can start ArcCatalog as its separate own module of ArcGIS. And I can go over here to ArcGIS, and I can start up ArcCatalog and open up its entire window and have the full functionality of ArcCatalog. Here, I just want to show you guys that I'm going to write out a file that I'm going to call, instead of calling countries, I clicked on countries and it put that name down here. I'm just going to call it cities. I don't want to call it World Cities exactly as the table's name because I might get a conflict between the files. So I'm just going to call it cities.shape. And I'm going to save that, and I'm going to say OK. And it's going to ask me a question. It's very polite, and it says, do you want to add it to your map as a layer? And I'm going to say yes. So you'll notice now I have another copy of it. It picked green this time around. Now I am free and clear of the events theme. I can just go ahead and right-click on it and remove it. And I don't need that table anymore either. I'm going to kind of clean up my ArcMap interface here. And now I have basically the countries as a backdrop, and I have my cities as points. And I can go back into ArcCatalog here, and you can see that now cities exists as a layer in ArcCatalog. So I'm going to go ahead and close that now. So a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about. I did address some of them briefly in the introductory lecture. Data frames, data view, layout view, data tools, and layout tools. So I'm going to minimize this. And so what we're looking at here is data view, and that's indicated by this small button down here, data view. And then, of course, we have layout view. So what you're doing here is you're just basically adding your layers that are going to create your map. If you want to actually go and print that map, you switch over to layout view, and now the page is going to show up as, by default, an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And you can change that in the File, Page and Print setup. And when that menu comes up, you can tell it that you want to do, I'm not going to use my printer paper settings. I'm actually going to do something like a larger, huge 34 by 44 piece of paper. I'm going to make it landscape, and I'm going to say OK. And you can see the rulers change along the side here. I'm going to take the layout tools, and I'm going to sort of dock them for just a second, and you guys are able to do that in your version of the software as well. So what you see here is the data frame for the data that I just loaded and that I just created from that table. So this, what is inside this box with these sizer handles, is reflective of what is in our table, our table of contents. So I'm just going to make that much larger here. I'm going to pretend like I'm making this giant map of the world. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use my data frame tools. And I'm going to undock these so you guys can kind of see what we're talking about here. This is why I spend time in this lecture talking about data frame versus layout view, data view versus layout view, data tools versus layout tools. So I'm going to minimize this, and I'm going to come back to this. So these are tools for navigating your data in data view, and these are tools for navigating your data in layout view. Take note, these are very similar. Zoom in, zoom out, pan, but notice that there's a little piece of paper underneath of all these, and this is basically to tell you, hey, I'm going to be navigating the actual map itself. Now, we can see that we're, our big piece of paper and our very tiny map, we can actually use the data frame tools within the layout view and interact with the map. So I'm just going to hit zoom to full extent here, and it's going to fill out my large piece of paper much better. And I'm going to go ahead and dock these back in here because I don't want those guys in the way. I have a tendency to just dock everything. Some people like to tear them off and let them float around, but that sort of drives me crazy. So as I mentioned in the lecture, you want to be mindful of the size piece of paper and the size points that you choose for your points, lines, and polygons. So if I were to grab this tool here, zoom in, that's going to actually zoom in on the data in layout view. It's the same size piece of paper. I'm going to zoom to previous here, and then I'm going to grab the other zoom tool, and what's happening here is you're actually zooming in on the piece of paper itself. All right, so that's one of the big main differences, if you will, between data view, layout view, the data frame tools, and the layout view tools. So if I wanted to, for a composition this large, you can see that my dots are fairly small. All right, and I may not be able to see them too well. If I were to take this back down to an 8.5 by 11, and just take that down to letter is what I want to do here, and I'm going to say OK. Now my data frame is much larger than my available space on my piece of paper, so I'm going to want to resize that. So I'm going to kind of pull this guy down here. Actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use my zoom out tool, and you can see this is the remnants of my big 34 by 44. I'm going to take it way down here and then zoom to the extents of my layout. And now you can see that in my data frame I'm zoomed in off the coast of Africa here. And I'm going to go ahead and expand that data frame. And then I'll zoom to the extents, and there I am. I'm back to having my world map. And of course, this interface also allows you to go ahead and add in your titles. I really don't recommend using the title because it grabs the title of your map document. I like to just use a text box, and you just insert text and it puts it in the middle there. You can manipulate it and put it wherever you need it. I mentioned in the lecture legends, north arrows, scale bars, verbal scales, what they call scale text. Those are all the different elements that you're going to practice in the exercises and place on the map here. But if I just wanted to create a title really quick, I would probably just create a text box, maybe bring it up here, and I'm just going to say cities of the world, let's just say by population class, something like that. Okay, and Arial 10 gives you the font. It gives you the font size. You can see that's kind of small, even on an 8.5 by 11. So I'm going to change that symbol, and I'm going to bump that up maybe to about a 20 and see what happens. And I'll say apply. And this is just an ad hoc, on the fly, just creating a basic map composition. Nothing really exciting here. I can add in a north arrow. ArcMap is going to have all these standard north arrows that you can add. Pick something, add it in, resize it, put it in an appropriate place. Again, keeping things balanced. Maybe it's going to be good out there. You guys will develop a sense for this as we work throughout the software, throughout the class. adding in a legend. Simply adding in a legend is going to give me what I have over here in the table of contents. But maybe I don't want to show every city in the world. You can see in Europe we're pretty dense here, and parts of South America and parts of the eastern seaboard, United States, coast of Africa. So if we open up the table on cities, we can see that there are different population classes that happen to be stored within this shapefile, within this layer. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on pop rank. So anything that is ranked a 1 is going to be the very large cities around the world that are 5 million and greater. So maybe I just want to show a map of that. So what I'm going to do here is I can use the symbology of that layer and say, instead of just showing a single symbol under features, I'm going to go to categories, which allows me to look at the values of all the different fields within the database and let me choose to show my data accordingly. So maybe I want to show the top 2. So one of the things I can do, I'm just using my shift key here to select 3 through 7. I'm just going to remove those values. I'm not removing it from the data. I'm not changing anything. I'm going to go ahead and remove all other values, because if not, 3 through 7 would actually show up. So I'm just going to uncheck that. And then I'm going to make the number 1 5 million and over, and there's only 3 of those 23 of those cities around the world. And then maybe some of the 1 million to 5 million, just to kind of give some context, but maybe I'll just kind of size them down a little bit and then say okay, and let's see how that thins out my map. And you can see that thins things out a little bit. So now I'm showing my cities of the world by population, not so much by population. Maybe I'll just call this population rank. Okay, so I realize I'm popping through this kind of quickly, but again, that's what the exercises are for you guys to go ahead and start practicing these things. So I don't like the fact that it says pop rank in there. I'm actually going to say population rank, and I'm just changing that visually in the table of context, population rank. And then instead of calling this cities, maybe I'll just capitalize it, because I'm kind of touchy about those kind of things too. So maybe I'm just going to call this countries. And you'll see that as the changes that I'm making here, I'm going to come back to inserting a legend, and they're going to be reflective of what I have over here in the table of contents. So for now, I'm just going to kind of take the defaults and go through next and select everything here and finish it off. And now a very basic legend, and we can resize that, and we can place it somewhere that might be more appropriate on the map. And so the really important point here is that this legend is tied to this table of contents. So if I make a misspelling here, it's going to show up here. So if I just change that back to population, you're going to notice that rank gets dropped over here as well. So these two are tied. A really good question that comes up is if you change the scale of your map, you zoom into a particular area, will that change your scale bar? So if I were to introduce a scale bar here, and I'm just going to select any old style and say okay, and you'll see that I've got a scale bar in miles. I'm just kind of placing that temporarily here. Don't take this as that's the best place for you to put a scale bar. It's just the space that I have available so that you guys can see the units. But if I were to zoom out back to the extent that I was in, you can see that those units changed. So things to be mindful of as you are building your layout within ArcMap. So we've talked about data frames, data view, layout view. We've talked about MXD files. Let's talk about relative pathing and exclamation points. This is really important when we're talking about MXDs. Again, we're talking about a pointer file. So if I were to open up Windows Explorer here, and I'm just going to navigate over to the folder that contains this data. Again, in Windows Explorer, it's going to look a certain way, and I'm going to talk about this in a future lecture. But I'm going to go into my AddXYDemo, and now the cities layer that I just created, there's a lot of cities in here. There's this DBF file, a PRJ file, an SBN file, an SHP file, SBX. These are all the files that contribute to creating that one layer in ArcGIS, and you see the same thing for countries, and then you see our original worldcities.dbf that we created the cities from. You don't see this information the same way in ArcCatalog. So if I were to open up ArcCatalog, you only see cities, you only see countries, you only see world cities. So things to remember, that your file system, Windows Explorer, is going to see things differently than what ArcCatalog is, but ArcCatalog is kind of your Windows Explorer for ArcGIS. That said, if the location of any of those files changes by accident or on purpose, you could wind up with some red exclamation points, and where they're going to show up is right here. So if for some reason I change the name of the shapefile, if I opened up Arc Catalog, and it probably wouldn't let me do it right now because we would get a sharing violation between these two pieces of software. But if I closed out this project and I saved it, excuse me, and I changed the name of cities to world cities, ArcMap is over here looking for a layer called cities. So if I open up the properties on that and I'm going to go over to the source tab, it's looking for something called cities.shape. If I go into ArcCatalog and I change that to world cities.shape, this in ArcMap is still going to be looking for cities.shape, and it's going to say, hey, where's my data? The same thing happens if you happen to take a project home or you bring it into the lab and you don't bring the data with you and you just bring the MXD file. That's going to be problematic because there's no data for it to point to, so the map that you may have created in one location is not going to show. So you would get these red exclamation points over here that you would then have to repair the link and tell it where the data is or connect it later. This is not the most wonderful map composition. I'm not the best cartographer in the world. I will admit that to you guys right off the bat. But one thing that I wanted to point you in the direction of are map templates and ArcGIS online. Before I get into that, actually, I need to make sure I address relative pathing. You'll notice again that I have everything contained within this one folder. If I tell this project under map document properties to store relative path names, what that basically means is, and I like to call this the mothership, if I were to save this MXD, which right now it is not saved, but if I were to save it into this folder, that MXD file would point into all of these files that create that rudimentary map that I just put together. If I were to take this entire folder and move it onto a flash drive or onto my desktop or onto the network, and I'm going to go ahead and just save that now since I set it up for relative pathing, and I'm going to go ahead and put that on my E drive. What would happen is that folder is kind of acting like what I call the mothership, and so you have contained everything including the map document, and I'm just going to call this countries underscore cities, and it's saving it as an ArcMap document, so I say save here. And so when I come back to Windows Explorer and go into that folder, I now also see the MXD file. That is an Esri ArcMap document. So this file is pointing to this countries layer, this cities layer, and this world cities DBF file, or that table. If I just minimize that and I look at it through our catalog, I now see that there is a countries cities MXD in my demo window, in my demo folder. So relative pathing is good in that if you tell it to store that relative path name, that folder can then exist under any other folder as long as it has all the data and has all of the MXD documents that refer to that data within it, and it can exist anywhere regardless if it's a C drive, a D drive, an S drive, a W drive on a network or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out. So again, getting back to what I was moving on to now, we've covered all of these things. ArcGIS Online, if you want to add some sort of context to your map, I'm going to jump back over to data view here, and let's say that I'm not really terribly tied to or love this countries layer. So what I could do is actually come up here and use these online resources. I can add a base map, and so ArcGIS is actually going to reach out to servers at ESRI in California, and that is going to give me once it loads here, some options to add some base maps into ArcMap. And so by the magic of technology, it has suddenly arrived. I didn't want to have too much dead time there in my demo, so I decided to just go ahead and pause it. So here I am, we're back, and I'm going to go ahead and click on the light gray canvas, and I'm going to go ahead and add that in, and hopefully that doesn't take too long to load in. And so again, by the magic of stopping my recording and bringing it back in, you can see that now that there is what we call the light gray canvas. This is a preloaded map from on the web. I'm going to go ahead and let that refresh. And now you can see what we call a scale dependency. More detailed information starts to come on with these maps. You can see counties start to arrive, and now we're going to get into, say, New York City here. And now you can see a lot more detail. And so we can use this light gray canvas as sort of a muted backdrop to spotlight our data. Again, as you look at adding base maps, there are all kinds of other ones available to you. Imagery is really great if you want to have some aerial photography as your backdrop. Oceans. National Geographic is teamed with Esri to make their National Geographic maps available. Streets, nice base maps for streets in here. So you guys can play around with those and take a look at those, but I just wanted to list those out as potential resources. So that's ArcGIS Online, our templates, and then exporting your map to a PDF or JPEG is what I want to wrap up with here. So I'm not terribly happy with what I did here. You can see this excuse me, basic map layout. It's not terrific. Well, I'm going to go ahead and just open up a new map, and I'm going to say, look, you know what? ArcGIS has done some of the work for me here. I've got all of these wonderful map templates that I can just add my data to. And I'm going to say, no, I don't want to save the changes to my ArcMap document. If you did, if you needed to save them, you would say yes. I mean, I could say yes here, and I will. And then it's going to go ahead and load up that map template. And that is a series of files that are stored within. I happen to pick Africa and Madagascar. You can see that there is already a cities layer in here that happens to be cities more than 5 million in population. But if I don't want to use that and I just want to use the cities layer that I created myself, I would actually go into cities and I could add that in myself. And there's the cities layer that we created from earlier from our table. And so now I have this wonderful map of, say, Africa. I could have picked any one. I could have picked the world and shown all the world cities. And now I have this nice layout that ArcMap already puts together for me. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on the layout here, and it's already got this nice legend. It's got a north arrow on there. I'm panning with the wrong tool. The professor's panning with the wrong tool. I'm going to try to pan with my layout tool. I was actually going to pan my data had I used these tools over here. All right, there's a Robinson projection information. We've got an Esri logo there in the corner. And so we'll zoom out. And now I have this nice template. You guys will actually get a chance to use templates in exercise 18. So if I did that a little quick, don't worry. Now let's say I wanted to export that map to something that I just wanted to email to a friend and say, hey, look, I made this map. It's got some useful information on it. How do I export it? Now for you guys to turn in assignment number 2, you're going to have to do this. So you're going to have to go to export map, and then that's basically going to dump it out to some sort of a graphic file like a PDF or a JPEG. So I'm just going to choose PDF here, and instead of calling it untitled, I'm actually going to save it as, I don't know, I'll just call it Africa Cities. And then I'll say save. And so it's going to very quickly, in this case, create a file. And you know what? I didn't remember where the path was that it was saving to, so I'm going to have to go back to export map and see where it put it. It put it in my AddXYDemo. Okay, so I can go to that folder. Don't always take the default, guys. That it could be something that could mess you up. And I'm going to open up Africa Cities PDF, and there's my PDF of that map. So whether you make a custom map for assignment number 2 or whether you use the templates, that's completely up to you. I'll put all the data up on Blackboard that you can kind of construct something yourself, or you can use the templates, but you're going to have to actually go out and screen scrape some of the earthquake data from the IRIS seismic monitor website and place that onto one of these maps and symbolize the data yourself. So you got a little bit of work to do, chapter 7, 18, and 19, and then exercise 2, which will be up on Blackboard.